There's a concept in social psychology called the bystander effect. Anyone heard of that before? Effectively, what researchers did, they wanted to understand why people fail to act in an emergency when other people are around. And so they ran this experiment. They slowly piped smoke into a room. No sudden emergency, just this quiet seeping smoke coming through the cracks in the door, but really hard to ignore. And what they found was really surprising. When a person was alone, almost all of them got up, went out, spread the alarm that there's smoke to try to make sure people knew about it. The surprising part is when people were in a group, it dropped to barely a third. So same smoke, same danger, entirely different response. Not because the group didn't care, just there's so many people. And I guess people just looked around at each other and saw other people sitting calmly and read that as a signal. Well, maybe it's fine. Maybe somebody's already gone and spread the alarm. I guess it's not my job, is it? Not my responsibility. And the researchers discovered that the greater the crowd, the greater the paralysis. So here's a question I've been sitting with for some time. What if the church had its own version of the bystander effect? I mean, let's go a little bit deeper in that. What if you and I had our own version of the bystander effect? Where we've seen the brokenness around us, we may have even felt something in here, but then we're scanned the room that we're in, we've scanned society and thought, well, no one else seems to be doing anything. And so we've assumed because other people are not moving, we don't need to either. So there's almost this internal dialogue that goes on, something's wrong here. Somebody needs to stand up and do something. But surely somebody's already onto it. It's not my job, not my responsibility. And it's not that we don't care, it's not that we're lazy, we just assume it's somebody else's job. I want to share with you the story of a man who saw a problem. He stopped waiting to look to others to act, and he stepped in to do something himself. He wasn't a prophet, he wasn't a priest, he wasn't a pastor, but this is the person God used to rebuild a broken city. His name was Nehemiah. And here's what I find really surprising. The repair didn't begin with a vision, it didn't begin with planning, it didn't even begin with excitement about the opportunity or possibilities. It began right in here with this ache. Now, his story dates back to 446 BC, so quite some time ago. And it comes from a Bible book we have, this effectively his memoir by the name that he had, Nehemiah. And so it goes back to the people of God in the 5th century BC. So some background might help if you're new or unfamiliar with the Bible. So you had this powerful army of Babylon swept in through the region. They conquered, the Middle East, which included Jerusalem. And they took many of the Jewish people captive. Fast forward 70 years, and then the empire changed to the Persians, who took over all of the Babylonians. They defeated them. And the Persians had a more I guess you could say, diplomatic policy. They encouraged the captive people that they had to return back to the cities that they came from. So a small number of Jewish people have returned back to Jerusalem. But the situation in Jerusalem, it's fragile, it's broken, and it's messy. And it's from this fragile, broken city that Nehemiah's brother arrives with some news. So Nehemiah's over in Persia. His brother's been in Jerusalem, comes over to Persia, shares this news with Nehemiah, and the news he hears is troubling. Listen to this. Those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem, it's broken down, its gates have been burnt with fire. Now, when we hear broken wall, we tend to think, weekend project, head down to Mitre 10, grab some tools, some materials, job done. But of course, these aren't like garden walls. These are like massive stone blocks, 15 meters high, 10 meters wide enough for horse-drawn carriages to ride across the top. 4 kilometers of broken wall around the entire city. And in the ancient world, a city wall, it wasn't just like inconvenience. This was about survival. Obviously, this is before the days of like flyovers and missiles and drones. A wall is what enabled you to sleep peacefully at night, not worried that you might wake up to raiders in your streets. And those gates, they're not just like entry points into the city, but you can think, this is like town square, council chambers, law courts, marketplace, all wrapped up in one. This is where the leaders would meet, where people would trade their goods, where society would function. And so this is, without walls and gates, you don't have a flourishing city. And for Jerusalem, the treasured history of God's presence among his people, this is like devastating. So here's a number I want you to sit with. 140. Can you say that out loud with me? 140. Thank you, 140. This is how many years the walls have laid in ruins. No, not just like one generation, not 2, but 5 generations. 5 generations of people waking up every morning, stepping around the broken rubble, and you can imagine the internal dialogue. It begins by saying, something's wrong here. Somebody should stand up and do something. But then like days turn into weeks. Well, maybe one day, and then weeks turn into months, and months turn into years, and years turn into decades. And before they know it, they're just like walking around the rubble and assuming, well, I guess that's just the way it's going to be. It's the way it will always be. And almost a century and a half have passed, and the walls, they're still broken. Now, to be fair, other people had tried. They had willing hands, willing hearts, set out to do something about it. But what tends to happen when people set out to do a massive repair job, there's normally some opposition that comes their way, and sure enough, they face that opposition that's common to all people, and the work stopped. Can you imagine what that did to the people in the city? Because now you don't just have like broken walls and no city gates, but also broken hope. A community that had watched people try and fail. And failed attempts don't just like leave things where they were, they also leave things worse. It's like the bystander effect takes on a new layer of logic. We've seen what happens when people step out and try to do something and repair things. Why would it be any different this time around? So you can imagine all the narrative and the dialogue that Nehemiah is hearing. But here's what I want you to notice about Nehemiah. He is a long, long way away from Jerusalem. He's actually in a place called Susa, the capital of the Persian Empire at the time. Today it's known as Shush. So here's a Google map of the area just to kind of get your, bearings of where you are. You've got like Shush over there, or Susa, ancient Persia. And then you've got Jerusalem. Google map says it's a distance of 1,531 kilometers, a 17 or 18-hour drive. Now, of course, there's no planes or cars or anything like that at the time. So, you're talking about like these ancient pathways that would take like weeks and weeks to get there. That distance is roughly the whole length of New Zealand, from the top of Cape Reinga to the very bottom of the South Island at Bluff. In other words, just kind of pan back and think about this. Nehemiah has every reason to say, this brokenness, it's not my responsibility. What's more, Nehemiah is in a palace. He has a good job, comfortable life. Every reason, again, to hear the news, feel sad for a moment, and move right on. But listen to his response. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. He doesn't shrug it off. He doesn't say, that's a shame, but not my city, not my problem. He doesn't remind himself that he's 1,534 kilometers away, that it's really somebody else's job. Instead, he sits down and he weeps. I want you to notice who this man is as well. Because Nehemiah is a cupbearer. He's like a palace diplomat. He's poised. He's professional. He's trained to keep emotions out of the room. These were the people who could hold themselves together under pressure, steady in crisis, unreadable in conflict. And yet Nehemiah, man, he is undone. Not because he's some weakling, but because he's allowed the gravity, the reality of this broken city, to a city he doesn't even live in anymore, to reach those tender places of his heart. I call it a dislocated heart, where God pulls your heart out of comfort and he sets it down somewhere broken. Personally, I know what that feels like. Back in 2021, I found myself quietly frustrated. If I'm honest, I was grieving. I sat at my desk reflecting on the state of the church across our country. And I knew that we needed healthy, outward-focused, multiplying churches in order just to tell people about Jesus. But it's like I scanned the landscape and realized there are all these new housing divisions going up, and our population continues to grow. I could count on one hand the amount of healthy church plants that I saw across not just Auckland, but our whole country. Something wasn't right, and something needed to change. But the weight of it for me just felt, well, it's too big, it's too complex, it's too beyond me. I didn't have a plan, I didn't have any experience or a strategy, but what I had at the time was a burden, this holy ache. I felt grief for the people who needed a church in their neighborhood that would speak to them. I felt grief for a generation who at that stage was growing up and had very little people showing them, telling them about who Jesus is. And internally I felt this grief that kind of wakes you up at night, the kind that lingers in prayers where you can't quite articulate the words you want to say, the kind that whispers to you, pay attention, because this matters. Now, I didn't recognize it at the time, but the Spirit of God was beginning to dislocate my heart, shifting me from my comfort into a renewed calling. I didn't know it then, but that ache would eventually lead us to sponsor 12 pastors across denominations to attend the largest church planting gathering in the world, to beginning a learning community for churches to explore what planting looks like across 12 denominations that we host here at Grace City, to seeing 43 churches planted in the first 3 years across our country, 2 of those plants obviously coming from Grace City, and a vision to see 535 outward-focused churches planted across New Zealand, along with many more revitalized. That vision would come later. At this moment in 2021, nothing existed except a holy ache that I was carrying. I've learned that ache becomes the birthplace of everything else that follows. Now, maybe for you it's not multiplying churches. Maybe for you it's a community around you that's falling apart. A generation that's been lost in our culture, or a neighborhood you drive through and you feel something, but you can't quite name what it is. It might be a family that's fracturing. It might be a friend who's disappearing into an addiction or something that's destroying them. It might be a workplace that's just far from healthy. And that feeling is ultimately the same as something deep inside that's unsettling, where you just realize it's broken. Something isn't right. Somebody needs to do something about it. And what I'm learning is my experience can be multiplied right across this room, and for those of you online as well. It's really the same story, it's just expressed very differently. Because something tells me there is a broken wall near you too. And while it's probably not a wall around a city like Nehemiah encountered, it's still something broken in either people or place. In fact, maybe you've been walking around it for so long that you've almost stopped seeing it. It's what 140 years does to a city. It just becomes routine that it no longer affects us internally. But I believe God doesn't place us near brokenness by accident. See, maybe even the last few days or weeks, you've heard something that you just haven't been able to shake. It might be a conversation, it might be a statistic, it might be a friend who's had this experience that just wasn't right. And you've been sitting with that wondering, well, what could somebody like you do about it? I don't believe any of that's random. So Stephanie said when you came in, you had a chance to pick up a piece of rubble. If you can take that right now. And no, this is not to like throw it my direction. This is for us to hold together. So it's not really a prop so much as a prompt. As you hold this piece of rubble this week, I want you to allow it to ask yourself a couple of questions. What does God see? And what might he be asking me to do? I want you to think of this rubble almost like representing the brokenness that you've seen or that you will see in the days ahead. Maybe you've been driving past it, maybe you just haven't been able to shake it, maybe you just haven't really seen or heard it yet, but I believe it will come. See, for some of you, you can like name it right now because you've been feeling it for some time, you just don't know what to do with it. For others of you, it might be this week as you just sit with it and allow this to remind you. Because I'm asking you to take it home and maybe just keep it in your pocket this week or your handbag or your man bag or in your car or in your office. And every time you will like reach out and touch it or see it there, it would remind you to ask these questions again. What does God see here? What's he hearing? And what might he be inviting me to step into? So this is going to be your weekly assignment, particularly for this week as we come around and observe what God is doing. And when you observe it, whether you're there now or whether you will be in the days ahead, I just want you to feel it, to hold that rubble and feel what you should feel, that ache, a holy ache where each story of repair begins right in here with something that we feel because something's not right. And many times God is inviting you and me to step in and repair what's broken. As we hold it, it's almost like this whisper that comes, pay attention. Someone needs to do something, and what if that someone is actually you? See, what I've learned is that before God gives vision, he tends to give burden. Before God sends us out to rebuild, he teaches us to weep. What I've learned is that every significant movement of God in history can be traced back to one ordinary person who allowed themselves to truly feel the weight of what is broken. See, I don't believe brokenness is never the end of the story. Rather, it can be the beginning of a renewed calling. Because before Nehemiah could build the wall, he first needed to weep over the ruins. But then in chapter 1, he does something else. He doesn't just stay with the weep, with the grief. Instead, he moves on, and it's actually something that separates people who just like stay in despair land. Instead, he doesn't just stay there. He moves forward into worship. So listen to how he prays. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love. Let your ear be attentive, your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night. In other words, God, do you see what I'm seeing? God, do you hear what I'm hearing? Because I'm looking to you. You're the only one who can make all things new. See, here in this chapter, I want you to see what I call this holy duo of weeping and worship. And it's so essential that they come together. You see, weeping without worship is the person who they see the brokenness so clearly. The injustice, the suffering, the world like falling apart. It's just they have nowhere to take it. And over time, if you just like stay there in the weeping, it's like that passion curdles into bitterness. Compassion hardens into cynicism or blame shifting. And it's like you become this expert on what's problem, but you've got, in the problem, but you've got nowhere to take it. You've got no solution. And I think we've all met people like that, or you've been in that situation yourself. Weeping without worship, I think of it like a torch without batteries. You're like waving it with passion. It casts no light. It casts no hope. There's no solution. Secondly, worship without weeping. Happens too, doesn't it? It happens particularly in churches as the person or the community is so caught up in their comfort, their celebration, that they've like stopped feeling the pain of the world outside. It's like we become disconnected from it, insulated from it all. It's more like an observatory on a hill rather than a light on a hill. So we start like studying the darkness, and we can like memorize and tell a whole lot of stats about the darkness, but we just like enter into the darkness because we keep ourselves at a safe distance. But weeping and worship, when they come together, grief and hope held in the same hands. It's like a furnace where everything begins to happen and everything begins to change. Weeping and worship is what's necessary. You see, Nehemiah refused to separate them, and this is what I believe where every great movement of renewal begins. So here's what I don't want you to miss. This wasn't a one-off prayer for him. It's an easy detail to miss, but as you go into chapters 1 and 2, there's actually 2 dates the Bible text gives to us. The first appears right at the beginning of chapter 1 when we're told this devastating report that he hears from his brother happens in the month of Kislev, which in our calendar would be like December. The second date is when you like turn the next chapter and you read right at the very beginning that Nehemiah approaches the king in Nisan, which is like our March. That's like 4 months. Over 100 days have gone on since Nehemiah hears the news and before he actually does something that we might see as like practical about it. The details are easy to miss, but this is like spiritually massive. In other words, Nehemiah doesn't like just react emotionally and launch a campaign. He doesn't like fire off some quick message to the palace administrator or kind of send out like a public press release or something. He just kept sitting with the ache. He kept talking to God about what he was feeling and seeing day after day after day after day. See, we live in a world, don't we, when so often when we want to finally do something, when something's been awakened in us, we think we need to like respond immediately. It's the person who responds first, who has the answer before the question's even been finished, who sees the problem and immediately posts a solution because speed signals like something about competence and strength. Which is kind of strange given what we spoke about earlier with the bystander effect, because our instinct is we don't do anything, but many times when finally we get awoken to something, we want to act, and we want to act now. Now, it has to be now. What Nehemiah does here is even though he sees that something needs to change, he realizes this might not be the time right now. So he sits with the ache, and he brings what he's seen, he brings what he's hearing to God, and he waits in prayer. Imagine Nehemiah waking up every day with the same weight that he's been carrying. In fact, it probably gets heavier day in, day out. He wants to act, but he just senses the time is not yet right. The walls are still broken, the people are still in disgrace, but he continues to serve his wine to the king, still waiting, still waiting. That kind of waiting, if you've been there before, it's hard. Especially for someone, I imagine, like Nehemiah, who's probably driven and capable, that clear sense of something that needs to happen and change. And that weight becomes heavier and heavier and heavier. And he need to discern that this is the moment to wait. Because he also had learned that in the waiting, some preparation begins to happen. In that waiting, a leader was being formed. A calling was being clarified. A heart was being aligned to the mission of God. You see, before God ever rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem, he needed to rebuild something in Nehemiah's life. The evidence of what was happening in that waiting is right here in the text. It's one of the most extraordinary prayers throughout Scripture. And I just want to take you inside of it for a moment, because my hunch is this might be one of the most practical things. If you're in that moment right now where you already know what that rubble is for you and you're wanting to just step out and do something, but God might be helping you discern that actually this is a moment of waiting and of praying, perhaps just going through the 4 movements of this prayer. It's like a symphony. These 4 movements might help you know where your next move is as you pray and bring it to God. This is movement number 1. First movement is who God is. Before Nehemiah even names the problem, he names who he's talking to. Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God. In other words, you see, you know, you're the creator, you're the one with power who keeps his covenant of love. Let your ear be attentive, your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night. You know, if you're, a person who just likes to jump in and like do something with kind of that instinct to act, it's hard to do this. Even in our prayers, many of us, if you're like, why like that, we like jump in because God, do you see this? We want to act. Nehemiah just brings it to God and speaks to him about it. He just lifts his eyes above the rubble and reminds himself of the one he's bringing the rubble to. God, this is the brokenness. I'm reminding myself of who you are, that you see, that you hear, that you care, that you have the ability to do something about it. If the first movement is who God is, the second movement is what we've done. He says, I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed against you. Now remember, he's not in Jerusalem. He's a long way away. He didn't cause the problem. It was like even before he was born. He didn't participate in the rebellion that led to the exile. And yet he says, we, not they. Not those people back then who did something in the previous generation, but we. We are the people who have sinned against you. You know, what I found is this is one of the hardest moves for people to make as we step into that repair project. It's really easy for a lot of us to like point the blame at the previous generation or at others in our society rather than actually own up to say, actually, all the traits that were in the previous generation or in the other people who caused it are actually right in here in our own hearts and the lives of our family. So Nehemiah identifies that in his own life because he recognizes he's part of the problem. He recognizes his own story within this larger story. It's a lot of honesty, not blame, finger pointing, but we. It's rare, isn't it? But it's what's needed in order to move things forward. You know, people who want to repair the world but who haven't actually sat with their own brokenness, they don't tend to get very far into the work of renewal. Confession, it's not self-loathing, it's clarity. You can't rebuild what you can't honestly own in your own life. If the first movement is who God is, the second movement is what we've done, the third movement is what has been promised. So what Nehemiah does now in this prayer, in this next kind of symphony in this prayer, is he anchors his hope not in his feelings or in what he can see, but in something larger than himself. It's like he reaches back through history and he like anchors this into the story of God, and he reminds himself of what God has promised in the past. And so he begins to draw from different elements in the Bible, from like Deuteronomy and the Psalms and different covenant promises, not necessarily word by word, but he's anchoring himself in like the memory of the whole Bible. So he says this, God, remember the instructions you gave to your servant Moses, that if you return to me and obey my commandments, and even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there. I'll bring them back to the place I've chosen as a dwelling for my name. For those of you who are like praying to be walking with Jesus for some time, this is like what many refer to as like praying scripture, to remind God of the things he's already said, that God, you promised to never leave me. You promised to restore, renew all things. God, you promised that your spirit would help us in our weakness. You'd give wisdom to those who ask. It's reminding ourselves of the promises God has already made and to anchor this problem in the midst of all that scripture has had prior. So Nehemiah goes from who God is to what we've done to what God's promised to the final fourth movement to what we need. It's when he asks specifically for God's help. So God, give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man being like the king, the most powerful man in the world at that time. Today, he prays. This isn't some vague prayer of God, would you like do something about this mess sometime, somehow? But it's very specific about what he's asking. He's come to this prayer with tears, the brokenness, the burden he feels, But he's not overwhelmed. He's looking to God and now specifically asking that God, there's something happening where his ache is starting to move in this direction. It's this expectation, and he brings that prayerful expectation to God. God, this is what I'm asking. I'm asking that you would show up and bring favor to the conversation I'm about to have as I step out of my comfort zone and be part of this adventure that I believe you're calling me on. So you might be carrying a burden right now. It might be for a person, it might be a family member, it might be a community, a neighborhood, a cause. And it might feel like they could never be renewed. They are like so far gone, and you want to see something happen. Or you might be just wanting to step out and do something about it immediately, even though you sense it's not time right now. It's hard to wait, isn't it? But you begin to do what Nehemiah did. He feels, he weeps, but then he worships and he prays. Remember, he waited 4 months. Your wait might not be as long, or it might be longer, who knows, but don't despise the waiting. If that's where you are, it's hard, but in the waiting, God is doing something. In Nehemiah's case, he was being formed into someone who would carry what was coming. His praying was the beginning of formation in his own heart. It's almost like his heart was a workshop where God was crafting, building something, renewing something in him. He was becoming the type of person, the kind of leader that was ready for the moment when it would finally arrive. And next week we'll see what happens when that moment finally arrives. When he will stand before a king and he'll ask the king for an audacious request, and the king will say yes. And resources will appear where they had really no business being there. But all of this will happen because something has been happening where God has been at work beneath all of this in Nehemiah's life and all the circumstances around. And so when that moment comes, it's a juicy moment in this story. But it happened because of weeping and worship. That weeping and worship is not just a renewal principle, it's really the pattern of Jesus. One day Jesus approached Jerusalem, the same city that Nehemiah wept over. And this is what we read Jesus did too. As Jesus approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. But before the temple was cleansed, before the cross, before the resurrection, Jesus too saw the brokenness of the people and the places, and he was deeply moved, this ache in him, and he wept. And then he goes on to worship and to pray and to bring the matter before his heavenly Father. And you see that weeping and worship throughout the life of Jesus. And then even before he began his public appearance, before he would choose the 12 apostles before Gethsemane, he prayed. Often he would spend the whole night praying. And often people would push him to act now, and he would say to them, no, my time has not yet come. My hour has not yet come. He discerned about when the time was right to step out and do something. This weeping, this worship that's often waiting, but he would eventually go on and act. And it's the same for you and me in this weeping and worship. This is the renewal principle. So let's recap where we've been. 140 years of brokenness. 5 generations of people walking past the same rubble. 5 generations of people saying somebody, somewhere should do something about it. Maybe one day, well, I guess it's just going to be the way it is. It's that bystander effect on a city scale for a century and a half. And then one ordinary cupbearer appears in the story who wept when he didn't have to, who prayed when he could have panicked, but instead this is the one who would step into this grand adventure of joining God in the renewal of people and places. Perhaps God is already stirring something in your heart, or will do over the days ahead. And I believe it begins right here with this holy ache, a burden that will not leave you alone. But the brokenness you see in the people and places around you, it never means that they are beyond repair. The question is not whether God can rebuild and renew. Of course he can. The question is, will you be willing and available to him to invite you into that work of renewal? So here's our big idea today. Brokenness is never the end of the story. It's the beginning of a calling. Weeping and worship, that's where everything begins. It's this duo that has to come together. So that piece of rubble in your hand, again, is not so much of a, thing just to take home. It's this prompt to remind you of these questions. That every time you see it this week, whether it's in your pocket, your bag, your car, wherever it is, that you would ask these questions. What does God see here? What does God hear at the moment? And what might he be inviting me to step into? So I've got a challenge for you if you're up for it. And I believe if you step into this challenge that's going to go on for these 8 weeks of the series, the Spirit of God is going to take you on an adventure. And if you're up to it, we're going to go, this is the direction of travel for us. This week is all about observing and then praying and dreaming and sharing, mobilize, persevere, celebrate, and then review and return. That's like the 8 weeks that we're going to be looking at, which just traces Nehemiah's story. There's a QR code coming up on the screen which can direct you to a PDF, which kind of breaks down some exercises for each week. You might want to do this as a household, your small group, or just by yourself. If you go there, which I invite you to grab your phone now, it's easier to do it now rather than go to our website later. There's a PDF there that kind of breaks down the exercises. You can download that or just see each week as we come to it. This week, again, I'm just inviting you to take this, and I want you to do 2 things. One, I want you to go on a 30-minute walk just around your area or your workplace. It's not to do anything. It's just to observe. Look at what's beautiful, and then look at what's broken. Just try to attune your eyes to see what God sees in this situation, what God might be hearing in this situation. Just hold the piece of rubble. Second exercise is this. I want you to actually converse with the local. It might be your hairdresser or barber. It might be the cafe person who brings you your coffee. It might be a school teacher in there. Whoever it is, just ask them, what do you see as beautiful? What do you see as broken? And just observe. So that we have, if you don't already know what your rubble is, that you'd allow the Spirit of God to start to shift something in you, that your heart would ache as his heart aches. Because a broken heart held open before God is always the beginning of a new calling. As we begin to pray, before we take communion, again, I just want you to hold this piece of rubble. Some of you already know what that brokenness looks like. For some of you, it's an invitation to go on a journey, an adventure, which if you're up for it, it's just allowing God to do something in your heart where you would weep and then worship, and then as we're going to see, to step out and see how God might want to use you over the days, weeks, months ahead. And as you go on that journey, my declaration over you is that you would not be bystanders, but that you will be known as repairers of the cities and restorers of communities. And it's the Spirit of God, here we are. We want to be a people that see what you see and to hear what you hear and to make ourselves available to respond to whatever invitation you might have for us, to step in even out of our comfort zones, to step out even when it's hard. And so we're asking that you would help us see and hear and feel. And as we observe, that we wouldn't observe as people who have no hope, but we will observe as people who know you, our Creator. We know you, the one who can make all things new, and that you delight in using ordinary people like us. I pray for people here and connecting today that are still exploring what faith looks like. That perhaps in this journey you would be doing something also in their life to see what you're capable of to make all things new. We look to you, O Jesus, the one who promises to make all things new. Amen. Amen.